But first, let's start with the topic of Bitcoin. People are obviously desperate and looking for somewhere to put their wealth that they perceive to be completely safe. The short answer to this question is Bitcoin is not that. Bitcoin is this so-called, cyber currency, and it is it's no solution to anything, and in fact, it seems to me that it's just begging for trouble, and it's you just begging to get your wealth confiscated in a very direct way. First of all, the thing about Bitcoin is that, it's this cyber currency, and the whole thing, I don't think a lot of people understand this. The whole notion of a Bitcoin having any legitimacy is the fact that every transaction that a Bitcoin goes through is permanently recorded, and so whenever you attempt to engage in a transaction with a Bitcoin, its legitimacy has to be validated, and the means of validation is going back and backtracking every single transaction that Bitcoin has been through. I don't think a lot of you guys realize that. Compare this clearly with even a US dollar, a $1 bill, or a $100 bill. And let's just set aside for a moment the obvious issues that we all have with the currency of the United States, the illegitimacy of the government, the massive debt bubble. Let's just compartmentalize all that for a second, and let's just look at the thing itself, a $100 bill. I can go out on the street, stand in front of a perfect stranger, transact business. He looks at the $100 bill and he has some sort of assurance that it is a $100 bill. The same thing to a similar extent with gold or silver. A person can look at a gold coin or a silver coin, the fact that it's minted, and that it has this specific patterns struck into it. That's the point of minting and putting images and so forth on coins, is so that you can look at it and validate what it is. The only way you do that with a Bitcoin is to go back and digitally track that Bitcoin all the way back to its origin. So I think you all can immediately see the massive security concern that you would have with this. Next, we can talk about the fact, and this is obvious as well, this is all contingent upon having a functioning internet. You have to have a functioning internet. The person you want to transact with has to have access to a functioning internet. What happens if there's an EMP? What happens if there's an electromagnetic pulse event and all of this internet goes away, even temporarily? Well, congratulations, all your wealth is now completely gone. And there's nothing you can do. You can't run out in the street and after this EMP attack and procure anything for yourself. Food, water, fuel, anything. By standing there and telling other people that, somewhere out in the deepest, darkest reaches of the internet, which may not even exist anymore, you had the equivalent of millions of dollars in wealth tied up in Bitcoins. Well, that information is completely useless. Okay, so having something contingent upon something as intricate as a functioning internet, and something that's frankly as vulnerable as a functioning internet, not a good idea. back to the notion of the rule of law and this business of doing transactions with Bitcoins. At the end of the day, this is still contingent upon a firm and functioning rule of law. And the reason that is because Bitcoin transactions have to be validated by a third party. If you're trying to do a Bitcoin transaction with an individual vendor, neither of you have the, excuse me, I'm still a little bit sick, still a little coffee, I apologize. Neither one of you individually has the ability to do this backtracking of the chain of custody of this Bitcoin. So this has to be farmed out to a third party. Whenever you bring a third party into anything, a functioning rule of law becomes absolutely necessary, because the third party can defraud or be incompetent, etc., etc., etc. Again, if you have no rule of law, and hopefully you all out there are starting to get through your minds how quickly the rule of law is evanescing in Western civilization. I really don't think that you want to hang your hat on anything that is contingent upon you having legal redress to, let's face it, a government. Who else are you going to have legal redress to? Are you going to engage in vigilantism if your Bitcoin third-party verification entity doesn't live up to his responsibilities and his duties in facilitating your transaction? Really? You have to get through your minds the notion that there will come a time when there's no one you can turn to, and there will be no means for you to redress crimes that occur against you. This is already starting to happen, obviously, and in my sphere of experience directly, obviously the MF Global theft was huge in that. A man steals $1.6 billion, and the people, the victims of the crime, have zero means of redress and no rule of law to which they may appeal, because it's all a function now of tyrannical oligarchy. I hate to keep beating that drum, and I know I sound like a broken record constantly talking about MF Global, but it was such a watershed event in Western civilization, such an underappreciated destruction of centuries and millennia of the establishment of the rule of law, just within a matter of 24 hours, destroyed. And people still cannot comprehend in Western civilization how it could possibly be that there could be a civilization or a culture wherein there is no rule of law. The example I use is the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto. Why didn't they, when the Nazis were rounding them up and summarily executing them and stealing all of their property, why didn't they just appeal to the rule of law? Because there was no rule of law to which they could appeal. They had zero means of redress. You can wave all the papers in front of the Gestapo that you want to, and you can rant and rave until the bullet actually enters your skull about how all of this is wrong, you cannot do this, this is illegal. You have to understand, when these systems break down, there's nothing you can do, which is why I made the quote a couple of years ago that unless you can stand in front of something with your assault rifle and physically defend it, you probably, in this sort of a collapsing civilization, don't actually have ownership of it. This has been this is something that a lot of the metals people are having excuse me, a very difficult time comprehending. People, year and a half, 2 years ago, would email me all the time asking, should I be buying stocks in gold and silver mining corporations? Well, that's perfectly safe, right? Or the other one was, well, I have quite a bit of my wealth allocated into precious metals, and it's all in a storage facility. And I have this piece of paper that's essentially a warehouse receipt that says I own X ounces of gold and Y ounces of silver. So yeah, I actually own this. Or I'm allocated into one of the instruments, one of the exchange traded instruments that claims to be 100% backed with physical sitting in a vault somewhere. And I just marvel at this. What are you going to do? What are you going to do when the system implodes? First of all, is the stuff even there at all? And what we have learned over the past several years with regards to COMEX and so forth is that no, the commodity isn't actually there. They don't have even remotely close to what they say they have or should have in vaults backing these futures markets. That's all a scam. It's not even there. They're issuing vault certificates with serial numbers to multiple people, obviously. I mean, that's how it works. You own this bar, serial number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, guess what? There's probably 10 or 15 other guys who have a piece of paper, a warehouse receipt saying that they also own bar number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And you have no way of auditing this, verifying any of this, none whatsoever. Again, no functioning rule of law for all intents and purposes, no means of redress because we're dealing with an oligarchy, a tyrannical oligarchy. So the whole notion of transactions having to be validated by a third party brings all of these rule of law considerations into play. And not only do you have a government that really isn't interested anymore in the rule of law, but it's actively hostile towards this paradigm. You have to have the state on board with a currency, with a virtual currency such as this, in order to facilitate this appeal to the rule of law and redress. Since bitcoins are not self-validating, meaning, like I was saying with dollar bills or metal coins or whatever, the entire structure becomes highly dependent upon some sort of rule of law, which then respects and backs the currency, provides some sort of structure for redress, and is not actively manipulating or destroying it. And the Bitcoin people have already been through a massive manipulation where, it lost some enormous percentage of its value almost overnight. We've also seen and continue to see massive manipulation in the metals markets as well. That was really the first clue that everything in the futures markets and so forth was going downhill quickly, was the massive manipulation that you could see routinely and that we continue to see in the metals markets. Are the metals undervalued right now? Oh, heck yes, absolutely. Of course they are. If the market was actually able to emerge and have any sort of integrity or be connected to reality in any way, the price of these metals would be significantly higher. And I wrote a piece, I can't remember, 18 months or 2 years ago, about how eventually when people figure all this out, and you see spurts of this, you see it in fits and starts, you're going to see a decoupling of the cash market, of the cash trade, from the exchange traded markets. We saw it in India for quite a while, where the spot price of metals was considerably higher, way over the exchange traded price, because people were just shrugging their shoulders and saying, since the exchange traded markets are no longer have any integrity, I can't even go in and arbitrage or try to capitalize on the difference between the cash market, the physical in your hand market, and the paper market, because I'm afraid that if I try to go into the paper market, they're just going to steal all my money, like with MF Global and so forth. And so when there's not even anybody willing to go into the exchange traded markets and keep them tethered by playing and trading the relationship between the cash market, the spot market, and the paper market, at that point you'll see a massive divergence. And usually what that means is that the cash price will skyrocket at some point, while the paper market languishes and continues to be just bogged down in its own illegitimacy. It happens in fits and starts. People are watching very closely the relationship between the two, but there's still that people are still holding out hope that there is a legitimacy in the exchange traded markets, in the exchanges, and sadly it just isn't there. We see that hope being held out, and people not understanding how manipulated, how false, and how computer driven also a lot of these markets are, because I still hear from people who are just absolutely mystified that I think anything's wrong because, well, the Dow's over 16,000. How can you be complaining about this? And they genuinely don't understand that the only reason the Dow is over 16,000 is because the Federal Reserve is printing out of thin air and pumping into the stock market at least $85 billion a month. If they stop doing that, the entire, and understand, that's all that's left. It's Fed pump, and then the volume that you see, the number of shares that are being traded and so forth. Understand, guys, that's not real people. It's just computers trading with each other. You know, to call it day trading isn't even accurate. The computers take these positions and get in and out within milliseconds. That's all that's left. The amount of actual people in there trading any of these stocks, or even futures. You know, you look at the floors of the exchanges, and even before I quit 2 years ago, I'd call down and I'd talk to the guys on the floor, and they just say, Ann, it's dying. There's nobody here. We're all just standing around staring at each other. There's no people left. It's just all these computers, and that's all of it. That's the futures market. It's especially the stock market. That's just a disaster. And that's the whole quantitative easing and the Fed pumping. And they've made it clear that the Federal Reserve has made it clear that they are just going to keep pumping and pumping and pumping, because it's the only thing that's keeping the Dow at the level that it is and continuing to inflate falsely, and it's keeping all of you calm. You all don't understand what's going on. You don't understand that this is all just a massive bubble that's being blown. The Fed so-called printing this money, which is really just making an entry into their computer balance sheet. But as we've talked about before on the blog, this is real, and this has a consequence. And what they're doing is they're pulling spending, and they're pulling economic activity backwards in time to the present from the future. With every dollar that they print, what they're doing is that they're stealing it from someone forward in time. And we're talking about quantities of money that are so massive that the human mind at this point literally cannot even comprehend them. The number of man hours that just the Federal Reserve in the United States has quote unquote printed over the last, let's just say, since the beginning of the Obama regime. It's hard. We technically don't even know. There's not transparency there, but we know it's in the trillions upon trillions upon trillions. I mean, we know that from Obama's deficit spending. We know how much it's reported that the national debt has increased. We actually don't have a firm handle on what it is they're doing through the discount window, meaning printing money, putting it on their balance sheet, and then lending it out to the big banks and the broker dealers at the window, at the Federal Reserve window at 0%. We really don't know how many trillion that is. The point is that it is, if we fully understand that money is a proxy for human life, a human's capacity to labor, create, reason, and produce, and we convert all of these things into time, into man hours, which that's the exercise that you should go through to understand these things. If we do that conversion, the number of man years that we're talking about is into the hundreds of millions of man years, enslaving future generations, borrowing against the capacity, the human capacity to labor, create, reason, and produce of people who haven't even been born yet. So this is just a Machiavellian theft scheme, except now, for the first time in human history, extended forward into the fourth dimension, into time, because they figured out that the easiest person to steal from is the person who doesn't even exist yet and therefore cannot put up any sort of defense whatsoever. So, and what this all comes down to, at the end of the day, back to Bitcoin, is that you cannot avoid the concept of the primacy of the morality of the people with regards to a currency. Bitcoin and all other schemes similar to it, and even to a certain extent, metals as well. You can make this same argument about metals, is that what people are trying to do is they're trying to find a currency paradigm that is completely divorced from human morality, that is completely divorced from the moral character and integrity of the people. And this is a false premise. It cannot be done. It makes no sense. It is completely irrational, because people are what backs a currency. The society itself is what backs a currency. You can make a currency out of seashells if you want to. You can make a currency out of zeros and ones on computer servers. If you have a moral populace, if you have a rule of law, if you have integrity, if you have means of redress, if you have justice, if people are punished when they steal the property of others, if your government is not populated by criminal oligarchs, any of these currency paradigms can, in theory, on paper, work. Because, again, what it's coming back down to is the people. There is nothing you can do to get away from the people, because money is itself human life. It is a proxy for a human's ability to labor and produce, and at the end of the day, for a man's existence itself. You cannot get away, ever, from the need for a moral society. You cannot divorce notions of religion and the place of the church inside or over and above a society. People are going to keep trying to do this. They're going to keep trying and trying and trying. That we have something that's completely divorced from all this because we don't like to talk about religion, and we don't like to talk about God, and we don't like to talk about sin. We don't want to talk about any of that stuff. We're going to figure something out that's completely removed from all that. And I promise you, all of them will fail. Because if you don't even understand what money itself is, you can never have a long-term functioning paradigm. It's just going to be a temporary fad, bubble, tulip bulb mania craze. That's all it's ever going to be. If you want something stable, you have to tie it to morality and a rule of law. So there you go. Bitcoin, no, sorry. Your best bet at this point is to be diversified. Actual commodities, like I said, the other turn of phrase that I use is you need to be able to roll around naked on top of it whilst holding your assault rifle. Then you might actually own it. So obviously, I'm a big fan of the physical commodities. I know not everybody can own agricultural property, not everybody can own farmland, and even if you did, you would have to be able to establish a perimeter and defend it, which is, again, very tricky. My business was cattle. Love cattle because they're food. You can literally eat them. You can kill them and eat them, and then you can take their hide and make yourself a nice coat or some such, or a pair of shoes. I love the idea of having wealth stored in cattle, but again, I understand that not everybody can do this. The metals have their strengths, particularly gold, because it's extremely compact and you can move it around easily. Obviously, farm ground can't move at all. Cattle can be moved, but again, you have to have fuel, you have to have trucks, you have to have manpower to do all that. So, you go back and forth. There's no single answer to any of this. This situation is hellish, and it's hellish for a reason. There's no good answer. There's no good solution that is going to completely isolate and insulate you from what is coming, for some people, for what is already here, and then what is also coming down the pike. It's going to get worse. So being diversified, some metals, some Federal Reserve notes, early on they will retain some level of value. So you will want to keep some of that around. But Bitcoin, being exposed to the internet, being exposed to government manipulation or shutting it down entirely, and having this enormous data chain whereby, by definition, if you try to exchange one of these things, it's permanently recorded forever and ever and ever, which again, nefarious entities could use to track you, come after you, et cetera, et cetera. You don't have that problem when you're dealing with Federal Reserve notes or even gold coins. I mean, once the transaction is done, it's done, and there doesn't need to be any sort of paper trail of any kind. So again, I think the Bitcoin thing is just a fad, and I think it's a deeply, deeply flawed premise. I wouldn't put anything into it at all.